In grammar, the voice gender of a verb describes the relationship between the action that the verb expresses and the participants identified by its arguments. When the subject is the agent or doer of the action, the verb is in the active voice. When the subject is the patient, target, or undergoer of the action, the verb is said to be in the passive voice. For example, in the sentence, "The cat ate the mouse," the verb ate is in the active voice. However, in the sentence, "The mouse was eaten by the cat," the verbal phrase "was eaten" is passive. In the sentence, "The hunter killed the bear," the verb killed is in the active voice, and the doer of the action is the hunter. A passive version of the sentence is, "The bear was killed by the hunter," where the verbal phrase "was killed" is followed by the word by and then by the doer, hunter. In a transformation from an active voice clause to an equivalent passive voice construction, the subject and the direct object switch grammatical roles. The direct object gets promoted to subject, and the subject demoted to an complement. In the examples above, the mouse serves as the direct object in the active voice version, but becomes the subject in the passive version. The subject of the active voice version, the cat, becomes part of a prepositional phrase in the passive version of the sentence, and can be left out entirely. History. In the traditional grammar of ancient Greek, voice was called delta iota alpha theta epsilon sigma iota sigma arrangement or condition, with three subcategories: active, passive, and middle. In Latin there are two voices, active and passive. Active. The active voice is the most commonly used in many languages and represents the normal case, in which the subject of the verb is the agent. In the active voice, the subject of the sentence performs the action or causes the happening denoted by the verb. Examples of active voice include the following: cabeza ate the potatoes. The verb ate indicates the active voice. But consider the following sentence, which is in passive voice: the potatoes were eaten by cabeza. The verb were eaten indicates the presence of passive voice. Therefore, for the case of active voice, it shows that someone has done something or has caused something to happen. But for the case of passive voice, it shows that something has been done by some else. Passive. The passive voice is employed in a clause whose subject expresses the theme or patient of the verb. That is, it undergoes an action or has its state changed. In the passive voice, the grammatical subject of the verb is the recipient of the action denoted by the verb. Some languages, such as English and Spanish, use a periphrastic passive voice, that is, it is not a single word form, but rather a construction making use of other word forms. Specifically, it is made up of a form of the auxiliary verb to be and a past participle of the main verb. In other languages, such as Latin, the passive voice is simply marked on the verb by inflection. Librum legit, he reads the book. Liber legita, the book is read. Middle. Some languages have a middle voice, which is a set of inflections or constructions which is to some extent different from both the active and passive voices. The middle voice is said to be in the middle between the active and the passive voices because the subject often cannot be categorized as either agent or patient but may have elements of both. For example, it may express what would be an intransitive verb in English. In the casserole cooked in the oven, cooked is syntactically active but semantically passive. In classical Greek, the middle voice often has a reflexive sense. The subject acts on a for itself, such as the boy washes himself or the boy washes. It can be transitive or intransitive. It can occasionally be used in a causative sense, such as the father causes his son to be set free, or the father ransoms his son. In English, there is no verb form for the middle voice, though some uses may be classified as middle voice, are often resolved via a reflexive pronoun, as in Fred shaved, which may be expanded to Fred shaved himself. Contrast with active Fred shaved active John or passive John was shaved by Fred. This need not be reflexive, as in my clothes soaked in detergent overnight. English used to have a distinct form, called the passival, which was displaced over the early 19th century by the passive progressive, and is no longer used in English. In the passival, one would say, the house is building, which is today instead, the house is being built. Likewise, the meal is eating, which is now, the meal is being eaten. Note that the similar Fred is shaving and the clothes are soaking remain grammatical. It is suggested that the progressive passive was popularized by the Romantic poets, and is connected with Bristol usage. Many deponent verbs in Latin are survivals of the Proto-Indo-European middle voice. Some languages have even more grammatical voices. For example, Classical Mongolian features 5 voices: active, passive, causative, reciprocal, and cooperative. Hebrew has active, passive, causative, intensive, and reflexive voices. The anti-passive voice deletes or demotes the object of transitive verbs, and promotes the active to an intransitive subject. This voice is very common among ergative-absolutive languages, but also occurs among nominative-accusative languages. There are also constructions in some languages that appear to change the valence of a verb, but in fact do not. So-called hierarchical or inversion languages are of this sort. Their agreement system will be sensitive to an external person or animacy hierarchy, 1 and GT, 2 and GT, 3 or anim and GT, in and so forth. E.g., in Meskwaki, verbs inflect for both subject and object, but agreement markers do not have inherent values for these. Rather, a third marker, the direct or inverse marker, indicates the proper interpretation. Niwa, pam EW, I am looking at him, but Niwa, pam EKWW, he is looking at me. Some scholars have analyzed this as a kind of obligatory passivization dependent on animacy, while others have claimed it is not a voice at all, but rather see inversion as another type of alignment, parallel to nominative, accusative, ergative, absolutive, split S, and fluid S alignments. Passive in topic prominent languages. Prominent languages like Mandarin tend not to employ the passive voice as frequently. Mandarin speakers construct the passive voice by using the coverb and rearranging the usual word order. For example, this sentence using active voice. Note the first line is in traditional Chinese while the second is simplified Chinese, corresponds to the following sentence using passive voice. Note that the agent phrase is optional. In addition, through the addition of the auxiliary verb to be, the passive voice is frequently used to emphasize the identity of the actor. This example places emphasis on the dog, presumably as opposed to some other animal. Although a topic-prominent language, Japanese employs the passive voice quite frequently, and has 2 types of passive voice. One that corresponds to that in English and an indirect passive not found in English. This indirect passive is used when something undesirable happens to the speaker. Fourth person in Finnic languages. Some languages do not contrast voices but have other similar constructions. For example, Finnic languages such as Finnish and Estonian have a passive expressed by conjugating the verb in common person. Although it is generally referred to as the passive in Finnish grammars, it may more appropriately be referred to as the fourth person form of a verb. The function of the fourth person is simply to leave out the agent. The agent is almost always human and never mentioned. The grammatical role of the object remains unaltered, and thus transitivity may also be used. For example, the fourth-person construction Niku no hajo tetian with a transitive verb means someone broke the window, while the third-person construction Niku no hahozi uses the anti-causative and means the window broke. Impersonal in Celtic languages. Celtic languages have an inflection, commonly called the impersonal or autonomous form, of similar origin to the Latin passive impersonal. This is similar to a passive construction in that the agent of the verb is not specified. However, its syntax is different from prototypical passives, in that the object of the action remains in the accusative. It is similar to the use of the pronoun on in French. It increasingly corresponds to the passive in modern English, in which there is a trend towards avoiding the use of the passive unless it is specifically required to omit the subject. It also appears to be similar to the fourth person mentioned in the preceding paragraph. However, what is called in Irish and British of the free verb does not suggest passivity but a kind of generalized agency. The construction has equal validity in transitive and intransitive clauses, and the best translation into English is normally by using the dummy subjects they, one, or impersonal you. For example, the common sign against tobacco consumption has its closest direct translation in English as no smoking. An example of its use as an intransitive is people often go to the village of a Saturday. The difference between the autonomous and a true passive is that while the autonomous focuses on the action and overtly avoids mentioning the actor, there is nonetheless an anonymous agent who may be referred to in the sentence. For instance, in English, the formation of the passive allows the optional inclusion of an agent in a prepositional phrase by the man, etc. Where English would leave out the noun phrase, Irish uses the autonomous. Where English includes the noun phrase, Irish uses its periphrastic passive, which can also leave out the noun phrase. The impersonal endings have been reanalyzed as a passive voice in modern Welsh, and the agent can be included after the preposition gan, senia y gan y cor. The song is sung by the choir. Dynamic and static passive. Some linguists draw a distinction between static passive voice and dynamic passive voice in some languages. Examples include English, German, Swedish, Spanish and Italian. Static means that an action was done to the subject at a certain point in time, resulting in a state in the time focused upon, whereas dynamic means that an action takes place. German static passive auxiliary verb, sein. Dynamic passive auxiliary verb, werden. Der Reisen ist gemacht. Der Reisen wird gemacht. English static passive auxiliary verb be. Dynamic passive auxiliary verb get. Note that for some speakers of English this is not accepted and is considered colloquial or substandard. The grass is cut. The grass gets cut. Of the grass is being cut. Swedish static passive auxiliary verb vara. Dynamic passive auxiliary verb bli. Dynamic passive in Swedish is also frequently expressed with the s ending. Dörren är öppnad. The door has been opened. Dörren blir öppnad. The door is being opened. The vara passive is often synonymous with, and sometimes preferable to, simply using the corresponding adjective. Dörren är öppen. The door is open. The bli passive is often synonymous with, and sometimes preferable to, the s passive. Dörren öppnas. The door is opening. Spanish has two verbs corresponding to English to be, ser and estar. Ser is used to form the ordinary passive voice, la puerta es abierta. The door is opened. La puerta es cerrada. The door is closed. Estar is used to form what might be termed a static passive voice. La puerta está abierta. The door is open, i.e., it has been opened. La puerta está cerrada. The door is closed, i.e., it has been closed. In both cases, the verb's participle is used as the complement. Italian uses two verbs to translate the static and the dynamic passive. Dynamic passive auxiliary verb essere and venire la porta riaperta, or la porta viene aperta. The door is opened, or the door comes open. La porta è chiusa, or la porta viene chiusa. The door is closed, or the door comes closed. Static passive auxiliary verb. Essere la porta riaperta. The door is open, i.e., it has been opened. La porta è chiusa. The door is closed, i.e., it has been closed. Venetian. In Venetian, the difference between dynamic passive and stative passive is more clear-cut, using ESER only for the static passives and Vegna only for the dynamic passive. La porta la inverta. The door is opened. Dynamic. La porta la verta. The door is open. Static. Static forms represents much more a property, a general condition, whereas the dynamic form is a real passive action entailing by someone, ESER protetto. To be protected equals to be in a safe condition. Static. Vegna protetto. To be protected equals to be defended. Dynamic. ESER considera. To be considered equals to have a reputation. Static. Vegna considera. To be taken into consideration. Dynamic. ESER representa. To be represented equals to have a representation. Static. Vegna representa alonu. To be represented at the UN. Dynamic. List. Voices found in various languages include active voice, adjectival voice, anti-passive voice, applicative voice, causative voice, circumstantial voice, impersonal passive voice, medio-passive voice, medium voice equals middle voice, neuter voice, passive voice, reciprocal voice, reflexive voice,